The heavy bronze coin strikes the wooden table with a sharp, final sound. Dust hangs in the thick air of the first-century Roman marketplace. We assume that before we knew him, we were just a bit confused. We imagined that our sin was simply a series of honest mistakes. Reconciliation is not God suddenly deciding to be in a better mood. It is not God overlooking a mistake. It is an objective, historical change in your legal and financial standing. God is no longer keeping a ledger of your failures, not because he is forgetful, but because the account has already been settled in full. The peace treaty holds because the infinite payment has cleared. But the king's grace does not stop at simply clearing the debt. If the story ended here, we would merely be pardoned criminals. We would be former enemies allowed to live quietly on the edges of the empire, constantly worried that the king might change his mind and open the ledger again. Because the ledger is completely cleared, our identity in the kingdom radically changes. God does not just pardon his former enemies and leave them outside the palace. He brings them inside, and then he gives them a new title that carries the full weight of his own throne. Imagine the heavy wooden doors of the imperial palace swinging open. A man steps out, carrying a sealed parchment, bearing the red wax emblem of the emperor. He is not a casual messenger. He is bound for the edge of the empire, traveling into provinces that are still deeply volatile and resistant to the throne. That God was mildly disappointed in our behavior, and that Jesus came to offer a polite apology on our behalf. In the ancient Roman world, this man was an ambassador, a legatus, when he arrived in a distant city and stood in the public square to read his scroll. He did not offer his own opinions or negotiate his own terms. He carried the absolute authority of the throne. To honor the ambassador was to honor the emperor. To attack the ambassador was a direct act of war against Rome itself. He was the physical embodiment of the emperor's will, sent specifically to secure peace and extend the empire's grace to a hostile territory. Immediately after, Paul explains that God has wiped the ledger clean. He reveals the staggering consequence of that transaction. In 2 Coríntios 5:20, he writes, "Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us to a first-century Roman ear." Placing this specific title on a former rebel was entirely unthinkable. If a conquering emperor crushed a treasonous uprising and decided to be unusually merciful, he might spare the lives of the traitors. He might allow them to return to their farms and live quietly under heavy watch. But he would never bring a pardoned traitor into the inner courts of the palace, and he would certainly never hand his royal signet ring to someone who had just dropped their weapons, so that God would change his mood. But this assumption fundamentally misunderstands the severity of the ancient ledger. To represent the throne, an emperor sent his most trusted, lifelong aristocratic friends. But this is the breathtaking reality of catalog. God does not merely tolerate his former enemies. He deputizes them. The king does not place you on a probationary period to see if you will truly behave before giving you responsibility. He takes the very people whose names were just erased from the ledger of hostility, hands them his royal seal, and sends them back into the world. He entrusts the message of the divine exchange to the very people who desperately required it. This is the highest proof that your reconciliation is absolute and final. God trusts you. He gives you what Paul calls the ministry of reconciliation. You are no longer a hostile outsider. You are the chosen vessel, through which the king makes his appeal to a world still locked in rebellion. The central contrast deepens. This is not ultimately a story about a criminal barely escaping punishment. It is a story about a former enemy being transformed into the trusted voice of the sovereign king. The objective reality of this new title changes everything about who you are. The ledger is clear, and the commission is given. But if we are honest, this grand theology often collides violently with our daily experience. Many believers carry the title of ambassador in their minds. The problem is not that the biblical concept of reconciliation is unclear. The problem is that we underestimate the depth of the original fracture. But in their actual lives, they operate like nervous servants. They live with a quiet, lingering dread that the peace treaty is actually quite fragile. They assume the king's mercy has an expiration date. They secretly suspect that they are still on probation, and that their daily failures will somehow reverse the transaction of the cross, forcing God to pull the dark ledger back out and demand payment. And this is where the ancient theology of the marketplace must confront our deepest, everyday fears. We wake up on a Tuesday morning, fall into an old habit, lose our temper, or fail to live up to our own standard, and immediately, the internal courtroom convenes. The air grows cold. The familiar weight of guilt settles into the chest, and in that moment, we make a devastating theological error. We project our own volatile emotions onto the immovable throne of heaven. We assume that because we feel distant, God has moved. We assume that because we are deeply disappointed in ourselves, God has crossed his arms, turned his back, and reinstated the hostility. We treat the creator of the universe not as a sovereign king who has finalized a binding treaty, but as a temperamental employer whose mood we must carefully manage. We try to earn our way back into his good graces. Paul does not describe humanity as a group of wandering, well-meaning people who just needed a little moral course correction, making silent promises to read more, pray more, and behave better. We hope that our improved performance will somehow coax him back to the table of peace. But this mindset completely dismantles the reality of catalage. Reconciliation is not an emotional temperature check. It is a finished, historical event. When two ancient generals met in the diplomatic tent and signed a formal peace treaty, the treaty did not vanish simply because a citizen in the province woke up feeling anxious about the border. The reality of the peace was grounded in the binding authority of the transaction, not the fluctuating feelings of the subjects. Your changing emotions cannot unsign a peace treaty that was signed in the blood of Christ. Your daily failures, as serious as they may be, do not reach backward in time and reverse the divine exchange. God is not pulling the heavy wooden ledger back out of the archives every time you stumble. The dark ink of your hostility is not merely fading. It has been completely washed away. You cannot be placed back on the list of enemies because the list no longer exists. This is the central contrast taking root in your own mind. Not a fragile truce based on your performance, an unshakable peace based on his payment. When you finally grasp this, when you realize that the king has permanently altered your status and refuses to keep a record of your treason, he forces us to confront a much darker reality. In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes that before Christ intervened, it breaks the exhausted cycle of spiritual anxiety. You can stop trying to pay a debt that has already been absorbed. But this staggering freedom creates an immediate and unavoidable crisis in our own hands. If God has permanently destroyed the ledger of our hostility, what are we supposed to do with the ledgers we are secretly keeping against others? We love the theology of the empty ledger when it applies to our own failures. But when someone wounds us, betrays us, or damages our reputation, our immediate instinct is to reach for the stylus. We pull out our own hidden parchment. We begin to carefully calculate the exact cost of their offense. We wait for them to realize what they have done. We demand that they pay the debt in full before we offer our own peace. We withhold our kindness, our presence, or our forgiveness until they can offer equal value. We secretly want them to crawl to our throne and sue for peace. This creates a profound contradiction in the life of the ambassador. The freedom of being reconciled to God demands a radical shift in how we view the people who have deeply offended us. There is a specific name that comes to your mind right now. A face. A conversation that still burns in your memory. Someone who crossed a line, betrayed your trust, or deeply damaged your life. The debt they owe you is not imaginary. We were not just lost or spiritually clumsy. We were actively hostile. We were enemies of the throne. It is a real deficit, and the wound is entirely valid. And because the pain is real, you have naturally constructed a ledger. You keep a careful, guarded record of what they did, how it affected you, and what they must do to make it right. You are waiting for them to offer equal value, an apology that matches the devastation, a change in behavior, or a public admission of guilt. You want them to sue for peace. But here is the crushing practical burden of holding a ledger. To ensure the debt is not forgotten, you have to constantly review it. You have to carry it with you into every room, rereading the dark ink of the charges. So your hostility remains sharp. It consumes your energy and hardens your posture. If you are an ambassador of the king, this creates an impossible contradiction. You cannot carry the king's royal seal of catalage in one hand while clutching a ledger of vengeance in the other. An ambassador's only job is to reflect the character and policy of the throne. If the king's policy is reconciliation, you cannot build a private kingdom of resentment. You cannot preach a gospel of cleared debts while acting as a ruthless debt collector in your own home. You cannot represent a God who stepped off his throne to absorb your unpayable debt of treason. While you stand on your own small throne, building our own rival kingdoms in direct defiance of the Creator. This is the hidden contradiction at the heart of our casual theology, demanding that others pay you in full. True ambassadors must offer the exact same unmerited exchange they received. This does not mean the offense did not matter. When God reconciled us, He did not pretend our rebellion was harmless. The cross proves how seriously He took the debt. Similarly, biblical forgiveness is not minimizing your pain. It is not forcing yourself to instantly trust someone who remains unrepentant or dangerous. Tearing up the ledger of revenge does not mean you erase wise. Protective boundaries. If you have suffered abuse or severe trauma, releasing the debt to God does not mean you must remain in the path of harm. Forgiveness is a legal and financial release. It is the conscious, a difficult decision to say, this person owes a massive debt, but I will no longer be the one to collect it. I am stepping out of the judge's seat. I am putting down the stylus. You leave the outcome and the justice entirely in the hands of God. What does this look like on an ordinary Tuesday? You recognize what is happening when the bitter memory flares up. You name the offense honestly before God. You place it next to the staggering reality of your own cleared account, and you deliberately choose to release your demand for payment. You repeat this practice as many times as the memory returns. A misunderstanding between friends can be fixed with a sincere apology. But a state of open rebellion against a sovereign king requires something entirely different. Letting go of the ledger often feels like a profound loss. It feels like you are losing your leverage, your control, and your right to be vindicated. But dropping the ledger is the only way to free your hands. You cannot sit at the king's table while still trying to operate your own small, exhausting marketplace of grudges to see what you actually gain in exchange. We have to return one last time to the ancient Roman square, where this entire journey began. Step back and look at the breathtaking architecture of what God has actually done. We began with a casual assumption that reconciliation simply meant God was no longer angry, that He had accepted a polite apology for our mistakes. But the biblical pattern reveals a much heavier, much more glorious reality. The peace you possess is not based on a temporary change in God's mood. It is based on a finished, historical transaction. You are not a probationary servant nervously hoping to maintain your fragile standing. You are a fully deputized ambassador, carrying the trusted seal of the king. And because your massive debt of treason was absorbed rather than ignored, you no longer have to carry the exhausting, bitter burden of collecting debts from those who have wronged you. An enemy does not need a polite conversation. An enemy needs a binding peace treaty. An unpayable debt. Return one final time to the heavy wooden table in the ancient Roman marketplace. The heat of the day remains. The noise of the forum still surrounds you. But look closely at the merchant's table. The silver and bronze coins are gone. The stylus has been laid down. The heavy parchment ledger is brought out one final time. But the dark ink of your hostility, the precise, unforgiving record of every rebellion, every failure, and every hidden act of treason has been washed completely clean. It is not merely crossed out, leaving the memory of the debt visible beneath the line. The page is entirely blank. The deficit no longer exists. And, as you look at this table of exchange, the scene begins to transform. It is no longer a place of ruthless commerce. It is no longer the tense diplomatic tent where a defeated enemy must fall to the pavement and beg for mercy. The table of the money changer expands. It becomes the dining table of the king, the sovereign who initiated the peace treaty, who paid the infinite tribute with the blood of his own son. Now invites you to approach. You do not sit at the far edge of the room as a pardoned criminal, keeping your head down and hoping to avoid his gaze. Mixed with the smell of sweat and hot canvas tents, behind the table sits the money changer, a stylus in his hand. Of treason cannot be smoothed over with good intentions. It must be legally and financially settled. The central question, then, you do not eat the leftover scraps of the kingdom. You sit in the seat of a fully restored heir. This is the profound emotional destination of Catalage. You can finally stop trying to constantly calculate your spiritual worth. You can stop trying to mathematically pay off a moral debt that the king has already absorbed. When the guilt of yesterday, or the sudden failure of this morning, tries to convince you that the hostility has returned, you can point to the empty ledger. You can remind yourself that the transaction of the cross holds fast. Your standing does not depend on your perfection. It depends entirely on his payment. This was never a story about an enemy finding the right words to surrender. It is a story about a king who refused to let you destroy yourself, who stepped onto the blood-stained battlefield, and who secured an unshakable peace at his own absolute expense. The ledger is empty. The royal treaty is signed. The long war is definitively over. Take your seat at the table is not whether God loves us. The real question is how a holy God actually removes the hostility from the ledger without compromising his own justice. What actually happened to our relationship with God when the cross removed our sin? When Paul sat down to explain the mechanics of this miraculous peace, he did something entirely unexpected. He did not use a religious word. He did not draw his vocabulary from the familiar rituals of the Jewish temple, the smoke of the altar, or the traditions of the priesthood. Instead, he looked to the noise of the Roman forum. He looked to the merchant's table covered in coins, and to the diplomatic tents where generals negotiated the surrender of hostile armies. He reached for a secular, political, and financial term that had never been used in a sacred text, to describe humanity's relationship with the divine. To understand the sheer, overwhelming weight of the peace you have been given, we have to walk into that marketplace. We have to look at the exact Greek word Paul chose. Section 2, the marketplace word. The Greek language of the first century was incredibly precise. When Paul needed to explain exactly how God, pressing dark ink into a thick parchment scroll, this is the ledger. It is a precise, unforgiving record of debts owed, dealt with human rebellion. He selected a word that belonged exclusively to the money changer and the military general, katalage, catalage. To understand what this word means, you have to strip away centuries of religious assumptions. The foundation of the term is the Greek verb alasso, which simply means to change or to exchange. When you add the prefix kata, it intensifies the action. It implies a complete, decisive, and final exchange. In the ancient world, it operated in two distinct spheres, finance and war. In the financial markets of the Roman Empire, if a traveler arrived from a distant province, their foreign coins were useless. They had to visit the money changer's table to perform katalage. They exchanged their foreign silver for Roman currency of the exact same weight and value. The transaction was cold, mathematical, and precise. The ledger had to balance perfectly. In the political realm, the stakes were much higher. When two nations were locked in a brutal conflict and the armies were exhausted, diplomats would meet in a secure tent to negotiate katalage. They exchanged terms. They returned prisoners. They signed treaties. At the moment the agreement was finalized, the reality of the two nations fundamentally changed. They exchanged a state of active hostility for a state of binding, legal peace. The English word reconciliation accurately describes the result, but it loses the mechanism, payments missed, and hostility accumulated. In this world, nothing is overlooked. Every fraction of a copper coin must be accounted for. When we hear the word today, we think of a repaired friendship. The ancient Greek ear heard a binding, structural transaction that altered reality. It was an objective change in status, not a subjective change in feelings. The day before the military catalage, a soldier on the border was an active target. The day after, he was an ally. His emotional feelings about the opposing army did not matter. His legal status had changed. What makes Paul's use of this word so jarring is that it was not a temple word. If you read the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word is practically absent from the detailed rituals of the tabernacle. It is not used to describe priests burning incense, washing at the bronze basin, or offering sacrifices on the altar. Paul takes a secular, transactional word from the streets and drops it directly into the center of Christian theology. He declares that at the cross, God performed a cosmic catalytic. God did not merely forgive us. He initiated a massive historical exchange. But here is where the ancient system completely falls apart. Both the marketplace and the military tent operated on one unbreakable rule: equal value. The money changer demands equal weight in silver. The opposing general demands equal concessions in territory or gold. A peace treaty is only signed if a debt cannot be paid. The debtor is not politely dismissed. They lose their land, their freedom, or their life, when both sides bring something to the table to balance the scales. The ledger of justice requires an equal exchange, but humanity had absolutely nothing of value to offer. We had no righteous currency to trade. We had no leverage to force a negotiation. We were the defeated, bankrupt enemy, possessing nothing but our own treason. To understand how the peace was made, we have to look at what the king did next. The rules of ancient warfare were universally understood and brutally enforced. When a rebellion against the Roman Empire was finally crushed, the offended emperor did not seek out the surviving rebels to offer terms of comfort. The defeated king or general was stripped of his armor, bound in heavy iron chains, and forced to march through the streets of Rome in a victory parade known as a triumph. The smell of burning incense filled the air, not to honor the defeated, but to glorify the conqueror. At the end of the procession, the loser had to fall to the pavement and sue for peace. They had to offer massive tributes of gold, surrender their territory, and often give up their own children as a guarantee of future loyalty. When modern readers open the letters of the Apostle Paul and read the English word reconciliation, this is not the physical world they imagine. The victor dictated the terms. The vanquished paid the price. An emperor never, under any circumstances, lowered himself to initiate peace with traitors. To do so would be a catastrophic loss of honor and a display of fatal weakness. This is the violent cultural backdrop that makes Paul's letter to the Romans so utterly scandalous. In Romans chapter 5, verse 10, Paul writes a sentence that would have sounded like political madness to a first-century citizen. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life? Notice the precise timing in Paul's argument. The text does not say we were reconciled after we finally dropped our weapons. It does not say peace was achieved after we realized the futility of our rebellion and sent diplomats to beg for mercy. While we were enemies, the Greek word used here for enemies is ekthroi. It does not describe someone who is merely unlikable or mildly annoying. It describes deep-seated, active, and hateful hostility. The rebellion was still active. Our treason was at its peak. We were not looking for peace. We were fighting for our own autonomy. But in Paul's theology, the offended king, we have domesticated the concept. Today, reconciliation sounds like a modern therapeutic exercise. We picture two friends sitting across from each other. Does not wait for the rebellious province to surrender. He does not demand that we crawl to his throne with a tribute we cannot possibly afford. Instead, the king steps down from his throne. He walks across the blood-stained battlefield, enters the hostile camp, and initiates the peace treaty himself. This completely rewrites the ancient rules of catalage. The exchange still requires equal value. The ledger of justice still demands that the treason be fully answered for. The debt cannot simply be erased without violating the moral foundation of the universe. But because humanity is completely bankrupt, the king provides the currency for his own treaty. He pays the tribute himself. The life of his son becomes the exact, infinite payment required to secure our peace. This is the core of the gospel's central contrast. This is not ultimately a story about an enemy surrendering to save their own life. It is a story about a king sacrificing his life to save his enemies. The cross becomes the ultimate diplomatic table. It is the place where the divine exchange is finalized, where God signs the binding treaty with his own blood, establishing a peace that we could never purchase. The transaction is complete. The war, from God's perspective, is definitively over, but this creates a profound legal question. If the king has initiated the peace, finally clearing the air after a long misunderstanding, we think of saying sorry, shaking hands, and agreeing to move forward. It is a soft, emotional word, and provided the payment. What actually happens to the massive, historical debt of hostility recorded on the ledger? How does God handle the dark ink on the page? Paul answers this exact question in another letter, where the accounting language becomes even more explicit. Return to the heavy wooden table in the marketplace. Look closely at the parchment. The ink is black, pressed deep into the fibers. In the rigid world of Roman accounting, a recorded debt could not simply vanish into thin air. If a wealthy merchant decided to erase a massive debt from his ledger without receiving silver in return, the debt did not cease to exist. The merchant absorbed the loss himself. The cost of the deficit still had to be borne by someone. The weight simply shifted from the bankrupt debtor to the merciful creditor. When Paul writes his second letter to the church in Corinth, he relies on this exact financial reality to explain the mechanics of the cross. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19, he summarizes the gospel with a single sentence: God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. Look closely at the phrase, not counting. The Greek word Paul chooses is logizomai, like the word katalog. This is not originally a temple word. Because we view the concept through this casual lens, we naturally project the same shallow dynamic onto our relationship with God. It is a cold, mathematical term. It means to calculate, to compute, to reckon, or to enter a specific charge against someone's account. It is the precise action of the money changer moving his stylus across the parchment, adding up the exact cost of a person's hostility and rebellion. The familiar, casual interpretation of forgiveness assumes that God simply closed the book. We imagine he looked at our massive debt of treason, decided he loved us too much to collect it, and threw the ledger into the fire. But that would violate the unshakable justice of the king. True reconciliation does not mean the hostility was swept under the rug. It means the hostility was absorbed. When Paul says God is not counting our trespasses against us, he is describing a divine transfer of debt. God took the stylus, crossed out your name at the top of the debtor's column, and wrote in the name of his own son. Jesus did not just offer a polite apology on the cross. He stepped into the ledger. He became the physical recipient of the king's justice, absorbing the full, calculated weight of our treason. The transaction of katalog was brought to its violent, victorious end. This changes everything about how you relate to the Creator.